Hey everyone, this is ShawniganHandshake. As a follow-up to our LP, I thought I'd do a bit of a plot summary video. If you're like me, you might have been left a little confused regarding exactly what happened in the Colonel's bequest. If so, this video should clarify things for you. Now, if you haven't watched our LP or played the game before, consider this your heads up to stop watching the video now, as I will be openly discussing spoilers. Let's begin with a run-through of the plot. I'll come back to discuss a few specific points of interest later in the video, but for now, let's just establish what is considered the canonical sequence of events and save any elaborations for later. We, as Laura, are invited to join our friend Lillian Prune at her uncle's mansion. Almost immediately upon our arrival at around 7 o'clock p.m., Colonel Henri Dijon reveals to his guests his intentions to give everyone present, excluding Laura, an equal portion of inheritance in his will. Should anything happen to any of the would-be inheritors before the Colonel dies, the portion of the inheritance they were to be awarded will be equally distributed amongst their surviving inheritors. Sometime between 7 o'clock and 8 o'clock p.m., our friend Lillian enters the attic using the skeleton key that we later recover from her dead body. In the attic, she obtains some old army clothing of the Colonel's from a large trunk. At around 8 o'clock p.m. that same evening, Lillian begins her murder spree, killing Gertie by throwing her from a second-story window. Lillian then flees the scene of the crime using the second-story veranda. This is Laura's first glimpse of the mysterious figure we dubbed Shadow Lady in our LP. At 9:15 p.m. we enter Dr. Field's room to discover that his doctor's bag has disappeared, having been snatched away by Lillian so that she could later use the contents inside, namely the sleeping powder, to murder the Colonel's help, Fifi and Jeeves. Over the remainder of the night, Lillian goes on to murder the majority of the house's occupants through various means. Some notable events that we see during the night include catching Lillian looking at the weapons cabinet at 10:15 p.m., and various instances of us finding Lillian acting strangely in the old playhouse. At 11:45 p.m., we witness a conversation between Lillian and the Colonel, during which the Colonel tells Lillian that she meant no more to him than any of the other family members. In response, Lillian angrily accuses the family of having been in on it, referring to the act of institutionalizing Lillian in a mental hospital. At 12:45 a.m., Laura witnesses Lillian writing in her diary. When we later get a chance to read the diary, we see that it's a follow-up on the argument Lillian and the Colonel had. Lillian continues to blame the rest of the family for having her institutionalized and declares that they have to go. The Derringer, which was kept in a glass case in the study, goes missing at 1 o'clock a.m. By 1:45 a.m., only Rudy, Laura, Kaylee, and the Colonel have been left alive. The rest have been killed and their bodies dumped via the laundry chutes into a secret chamber. Laura was able to discover the whereabouts of the secret chamber by following clues left behind by Thomas and Mary Couton, who previously occupied the mansion. Their daughter Sarah, to whom the clues were originally addressed, grew up and married, becoming the mother of the Colonel, Ethel, and Gertie's husband. At 1:45 a.m., Rudy begins searching Laura and Lillian's room attempting to find the doctor's bag. Sometime between then and 2:15 a.m., Lillian and Rudy cross paths in the hedge garden, and a struggle ensues. Rudy manages to disarm Lillian and shoot her with the Derringer. At 2:15 a.m., Laura finds Lillian dead. Laura takes the skeleton key, the Derringer, and the single bullet that was left behind. Meanwhile, Rudy has gone to the Colonel and told him about Lillian's murder spree, and about how Rudy had to kill Lillian in self-defense. Rudy then lures the Colonel to the attic upstairs and attempts to murder him using a hypodermic needle that Rudy obtained from Dr. Field's bag. We didn't see this in our LP, but before proceeding into the attic for the final part of the game, you can enter the Colonel's room to see the bag on the floor. Upon entering the attic, Laura has to stop the fight between Rudy and the Colonel by shooting one of the men. If you shoot Rudy, the Colonel will repeat to Laura Rudy's message that he killed Lillian in self-defense. According to Rudy, Lillian had gone berserk out of jealousy, and was killing anyone she perceived as having gotten between her and the Colonel. If you shoot the Colonel, Rudy will claim that it was the Colonel who had been murdering everyone, having lured them to the mansion with the promise of their inheritance. In Rudy's version of the events, It was the Colonel that lured him to the attic and attempted to kill him with the hypodermic needle. In the Rudy ending, Rudy presumably goes on to inherit the Colonel's fortune, the events of the entire night being placed on the shoulders of Colonel Henri Dijon. In the Colonel's ending, Rudy is presumably arrested for the attempted murder on the Colonel. Lillian is revealed as the murderer of the rest of the family members, and the Colonel decides that all of his inheritance will go to his cook, Kaylee. For her efforts, Laura Bow is rewarded with being able to keep a bag of jewels that she discovered in the crypt of the Croutons. In both endings, the game concludes with Laura Bow beginning the journey home to New Orleans. So, that's a trimmed down version of the plot of the game. As you've noticed, none of the backstory regarding the other family members, such as Clarence's horse racing, Wilbur's blackmailing of Gloria, etc., have any bearing on the plot. Their backstories and the random items we find at the scene of the murders, such as Ethel's hanky and the feathers from Gloria's boa, serve as red herrings for the player, or they're intended to be interpreted as evidence planted by Lillian. In the end, only Rudy and Lillian's backstory are good to know to be able to understand their motivations better. Rudy has numerous large gambling debts that are probably what drive him to attempt to murder the Colonel in the finale. With Lillian dead, Rudy was the only surviving inheritor left. Had he simply waited for the Colonel to die a natural death, he could have inherited everything legally. Either his gambling debts had to be paid off immediately, or his greed clouded his judgment and pressed him to act. Lillian's backstory is that her father committed suicide when she was very young. During this very emotional and unstable period in her life, the Colonel gave assistance to Lillian and her mother. The young and likely emotionally vulnerable Lillian viewed the Colonel's assistance as an indication of favoritism, that the Colonel loved her more than his other relatives. This made such an impression on the young Lillian that she began to see the Colonel as a surrogate father figure. However, their conversation later in the game reveals that Lillian had no higher standing in the Colonel's eyes than any of his dickish, greedy relatives. For Lillian, who obviously cares more about the Colonel's approval than his money, this comes as a huge blow. Lillian placed her relationship with the Colonel on a pedestal, and here she finds that that relationship was very one-sided. Based on Rudy's message that the Colonel relays to Laura, one interpretation of Lillian's motive is that she murdered the rest of the family members because she saw them as obstacles between herself and the Colonel, that she was driven insane by jealousy. However, there's another possible interpretation to be made, based on Lillian's diary entry and information learned through her argument with the Colonel. At some point growing up, Lillian was sent to a mental institution. It's not really explained in the game why she was sent there, i.e., what her possible illness may be. We see some obviously strange behavior from Lillian during the game, but an actual diagnosis of what may be causing this behavior, and the confirmation of if this type of behavior was why she was committed in the first place, isn't given. In the argument and in her diary, Lillian mentions that she blames her institutionalization on her family members. In her diary, she writes, "Between you and me, diary, you know they have to go, because of what they all did to me. I know they were all in on it together to have me put away in the nut house. I was never crazy. They just wanted me out of the picture." So, this seems to suggest an alternative interpretation to Lillian's motive. That is, it wasn't due to jealousy like Rudy suggests. Instead, Lillian may have been enacting revenge for what she believes was a false institutionalization. Based on her strange behavior in the playhouse, regardless of which motivation Lillian may have had, it seems that the game very strongly wants us to understand that Lillian's mental illness is a key, or at least contributing factor, to her murder spree, amplifying either her jealousy, her desire for revenge, or a combination of both motives together. At this point, I would like to point out something that I feel is a bit of a failure of the game, namely, there's not really any hard evidence that convicts Lillian of the murders. The majority of what convicts Lillian in the game is pretty circumstantial, and I'd like to specifically mention once again our first verbal confirmation of Lillian being the murderer in the Colonel's ending, what's considered the good or true ending, comes from the story Rudy tells to the Colonel. How do we know if Rudy is telling the truth? Keep in mind that this explanation comes immediately after Rudy had just attempted to murder the Colonel, and that had Rudy been successful in killing the Colonel, the story he would have told to Laura would instead peg the Colonel as the murderer. Rudy is an unreliable narrator, and yet it's through him that the game confirms for the player the fact that all the murders were performed by Lillian. Lillian's suspicious behavior is mostly what pins her as the chief suspect. Although we find fingerprints in the game, there isn't a point where we compare these fingerprints to any of the house's inhabitants. We use the fingerprints provided in the manual to answer the game's copy protection, but that's it. Though there's opportunity to do so, there's never a moment where Laura lifts fingerprints from the various murder weapons and identifies the print as coming from Lillian. Laura never catches Lillian in the act of murdering someone. We never catch Lillian disposing of a body. Lillian never gets a chance to confess to the crimes, etc. Even her diary entry, while incriminating, doesn't necessarily concretely prove Lillian's guilt. Lillian may be uttering a threat with the "they have to go" remark, but how in a court of law would you prove that she actually followed through on the threat? We see Lillian in the clothes of the Shadow Lady, who the game implies to be the murderer in disguise. But for all we know, Rudy dressed Lillian in these clothes after her death. Hypothetically, what if it was Rudy who was the murderer? Maybe it was Rudy who left the note saying, "Meet me in the hedge garden," his plan being to lure Lillian to the garden so that he could murder her and dress her in the murderer's clothes. Rudy goes with the explanation of the Colonel was the killer to Laura, likely only because Laura walked in on him in the midst of trying to kill the Colonel. Rudy needed an explanation as to why he was trying to overpower the Colonel, to shield himself from suspicion. Claiming self-defense was his best option. Had Laura not walked in when she did, and instead arrived after Rudy had been able to kill the Colonel, perhaps Rudy would have stuck with the explanation that his insane cousin murdered the Colonel and everyone else in the house. Because of her history of mental illness, Lillian is the perfect scapegoat for the murders, and anyone familiar with her institutionalization, i.e. any of her family members, would know this and be able to use it to their advantage. Ultimately, this is just pure conjecture. As in Laura's notepad at the end of the game, we see Lillian listed as the one who killed the most people. So, the game does confirm Lillian's guilt, it's just that it does so somewhat unsatisfactorily. I believe it was the game's full intention to have Lillian be the sole murderer. I just feel as though the game itself doesn't provide enough concrete evidence for Laura and the player to come to a conclusive decision prior to the reveal. The game seems to purposefully abstain from the ability to do proper detective work due to a desire to keep you guessing until the bitter end. In the Sherlock Holmes stories, the reader is given the same evidence that Sherlock Holmes is given, and they get to try their hand at competing against the consulting detective to see if they can beat him to the punch in solving the mystery. Sherlock generally doesn't withhold evidence from the reader. Rather, he simply refrains from explaining the significance of certain pieces of evidence until he himself is 100% sure that his deductions are correct. During this time, there's nothing preventing the reader from being able to make the same deductions as Sherlock, using the same evidence. When Sherlock does reveal his conclusions, he does so in a way that connects all the previously displayed evidence together, and oftentimes reveals that seemingly innocuous things presented to the reader were actually pivotal pieces of evidence. The Sherlock Holmes stories do a good job of hiding things in plain sight, providing a potential surprise for the reader without withholding evidence to do so. The Colonel's Bequest doesn't so much withhold physical evidence, as that would infer there is some physical evidence to be revealed at a later point in the game. Instead, it tends to refrain from showing any existence of this evidence in the first place. It overloads you with possible suspects and motives, and it's only through the deaths of various characters that it permits you to ascertain their appropriate guilt or innocence. You get to cross them off the suspect list if they get killed, and put them further under suspicion if they remain alive. Once again, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence casting suspicion on Lillian, but the hard evidence just isn't there to back it up. That's my opinion anyways. Please feel free to leave your own opinions in the comments on this video. If there's anything I've missed, anything you respectfully disagree with, or anything you feel I haven't considered, please share your thoughts. Despite my criticisms, overall Genghis Kate and I had a lot of fun with the Colonel's Bequest, and we look forward to tackling another Laura Bow game in the future. So once again, thank you all for joining us in this LP. We look forward to seeing you in our next adventure.